So thank you everyone for coming. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Brett Fajen. He's professor in the Cognitive Science Department at Rensselaer Polytechnic in Troy, New York. He has a bachelor in math from Bucknell, a PhD in experimental psychology from the University of Connecticut, and then he worked as a postdoctoral fellow with Bill Warren at Brown before starting at RPI. I've known Brett for a long time. He's definitely very well known for his very interesting modeling work, comprehensive modeling of locomotion, obstacle avoidance, all kinds of activities like that. And his interesting experimental work as well. I think he may be talking about some of it today, but he's done quite a bit of work on look-aheads in flip-fall placement and other work. His general research interests include sensory-motor control with a focus on visual control of locomotion in complex and dynamic environments. And that's definitely what he's going to talk to us about today. He's also talked about the perception of affordances of self-motion and object motion, the control of steering, interception, obstacle avoidance, and foot placement during walking over complex terrains, which is the work that I was just talking about. So take it away, Brett. We're very happy to hear from you.
Thank you, Rob, and thank you for the invitation. I was really excited to be invited because it's not often that you get the opportunity to present to such an interdisciplinary group. So my background is in experimental psychology, but the research that I'm going to present today definitely wouldn't have been possible without collaborations with people in computational neuroscience and computer vision and robotics and even game design, actually. So I can definitely appreciate the benefits of studying vision from multiple perspectives, and I'm really looking forward to hearing the feedback that comes from all the different vantage points that are represented here. By the way, feel free to jump in with questions at any time. So, it would be great if this is, interactive. So I welcome your questions. I do have lots of videos in this talk. They will probably be somewhat jerky, at least, less smooth than they will be on my machine. So fingers crossed that they'll be smooth enough for you to at least follow along. Okay, so as the title indicates, I'm going to talk about optic flow based perception and control in complex and dynamic environments. This is a topic that has been my main research interest since I was a graduate student at UConn back in the 1990s. And for pretty much as long as I can remember, many of us who study optic flow based perception and control have a kind of geeky obsession with this speeder bike chase scene in Return of the Jedi, the one that takes place in the forest of Endor. I'm sure you turn down the volume there. So we love this scene because it has, so many of the key ingredients, right? Rich optic flow and motion parallax, the need to kind of accurately perceive whether one is on a collision course with an object, high-speed steering and obstacle avoidance, and the perception of affordances like the passability of narrow gaps. So for most of my career, I've approached this problem using psychophysical and behavioral methods, but more recently, because of some of the collaborations that I mentioned a minute or two ago, and because of the availability of certain new technologies, I've had the opportunity to combine those approaches with computational neuromodeling and as well as robotics. So that's opened up some really exciting new ways of studying high-speed steering and obstacle avoidance, albeit the less extreme version that we see here on planet Earth. So I'm just going to start with some basics here. I know this is a general audience, so I think most of you know that optic flow is the streaming pattern of optical motion that results from self-motion, and really provides moving observers with a rich source of information about both their movement through the world as well as the structure of the environment. One particular problem that has attracted a lot of attention is the perception of the direction of self-motion or heading from optic flow. So a good starting point here is, and again, I know this is probably very familiar to many of you, but just want to make sure we're all on the same page to get started here. Kind of singularity in the flow field, right? Which in the case of smooth forward locomotion through a static environment is the point from which the optical motion radiates. And this feature, of course, is the focus of expansion. And it's significant because it's of its alignment with the observer's direction of heading. So by just locating the focus of expansion, a moving observer could perceive the direction in which they're moving. So you might wonder how an idea as simple as and intuitive as this could be the impetus for decades of research. Well, one reason is that the problem of perceiving self-motion direction from optic flow is definitely not a simple matter of locating the focus of expansion, right? In naturalistic environments, the presence of moving objects, the need to direct gaze toward objects of interest, and the necessity to move along complex curvilinear paths alter the radial flow pattern. And much of the research on heading perception has focused on how people perceive self-motion under these more naturalistic conditions. Many of the same questions about the perception of self-motion have been approached from a neurophysiological perspective. And early studies during the 80s and 90s revealed cells in dorsal MST with large receptive fields, as well as selectivity for the kinds of optical patterns generated by self-motion, radial and laminar and even spiral patterns. And over the past 15 years or so, actually really a great deal of progress has been made by people like Greg DeAngelis and Dora Angelaki in understanding the neural mechanisms involved in the perception of heading in these kinds of complex scenarios, like when moving objects are present or during eye rotation, as well as the multisensory contributions to self-motion perception. On that note, by the way, although my focus is on vision in general and optic flow in particular, I definitely don't want to diminish the importance of other visual information, as well as non-visual information. Certainly those sources of information are clearly important, and some of you who have a great deal of expertise in those areas can help me better understand how they contribute. So all of this knowledge has made it possible to develop computational neural models of optic flow processing, such as the competitive dynamics model that you see here. This model was developed by Oliver Layton when he was a postdoc in my lab a few years ago. He's now an assistant professor at Colby College. The most interesting things in this model happen in areas MT and MST, which are organized into two processing streams, a kind of dorsal stream that comprises MT plus and dorsal MST, which is involved in processing of global motion for self-motion perception, as well as a ventral stream that comprises MT minus and ventral MST, and is involved in the processing of local motion for primarily for object motion perception. So MSTD contains a variety of cell types in the model with sensitivities to different flow patterns like radial and laminar and spiral. And signals from dorsal MSTD feed back to MSTV as well as MT minus, and can be thought of as kind of predictions of the incoming signals. So to the degree that they match, they kind of cancel out. So what remains and what is kind of fed forward is a kind of error in the prediction. So this allows the model to recover object motion in a reference frame that's fixed in the world and independent of how the agent is moving, which is really critical for navigation in dynamic environments. So I won't talk about this particular aspect of the model today, but there is a version of the model that has disparity tuning. So the feedback from MSTD is speed and depth dependent in this version of the model in a way that's consistent with motion parallax. So it maximally suppresses the activity in MT that collectively encodes the self-motion estimate in dorsal MST. And that's really critical for helping the model to disambiguate different combinations of speed and depth, which is really crucial for things like flow parsing, right, for perception of object motion during self-motion. And as we developed the model, Oliver and I systematically tested it by comparing model estimates to human psychophysical judgments in studies of heading perception as well as object motion perception, and demonstrated that the model is able to capture a fairly wide variety of findings in this regard. So a quick word about how we visualize heading estimates generated by the model, which I'm going to start to show in a few minutes. We use a kind of heat map where yellow regions indicate FOE locations of cells that are most active. So these are the ones that best match the detected optic flow. And the blue regions indicate FOE locations that are least active, that are not good matches. You'll also see, whoops, try that again. You'll also see this kind of red crosshair that indicates the true heading direction, as well as a blue X that indicates the location of the maximally active radial cell, which we defined as the heading estimate for the model. And then lastly, there are these blue and red lines to the side and at the top that correspond to the vertical and the horizontal heading. So red for actual and blue for the model estimate. So you'll see a bunch of these throughout my talk. Now, of course, in addition to perceiving self-motion, we also have to move, right? And research on this topic has led to the development of a collection of information-based control strategies, these kind of direct mappings from certain optical variables to certain action variables that nicely capture basic locomotor tasks like steering toward an opening or intercepting a moving target, catching an object that might be flying through the air like a fly ball, and controlling deceleration to stop safely at a target. Optic flow-based strategies have also been identified and explored for flying insects. These include strategies for flying down narrow corridors, which is done by equalizing the rate of flow, as well as executing soft landings by kind of maintaining a constant ground flow rate, which requires one to decelerate as altitude decreases. And this work has inspired people, including some of the same people who study flying insects like Srinivasan, to build flying robots that guide their movement using optic flow. So for example, this like grazing landing strategy, keeping a constant ground flow rate was implemented in a fixed wing aircraft. The video over on the right shows a more direct landing with using a kind of constant divergence rate. So keep the expansion rate essentially constant, which requires one to decelerate as the quadcopter gets closer to the ground. So I want to highlight this work here because I think it really kind of underscores a very natural synergy between biology and aerial robotics that is, I think, very exciting for several reasons. First, these small aerial robots really provide a natural test bed for models of visual control. You know, these things like small quadcopters have a very small payload and a small power supply, so they're unable to use the kind of sensor suites that are available on larger ground-based robots and autonomous vehicles. So there's kind of a premium, right, for vision-based solutions. Although there are obvious differences between, you know, flying insects and aerial robots in terms of mechanisms, this still, you know, implementation of these strategies encourages us to think more broadly about the general nature of the problem, independent of specific mechanisms, which I think can be quite valuable. It also forces us to think about the robustness of our solutions, which is really useful because existing optic flow-based strategies are more fragile and inflexible than I think at least I had realized before. The fact that these models are not so easily adapted to real-world conditions, I think provides some clues about what we might be missing and what we can where we can make some progress. And, you know, of course, this can lead to novel bio-inspired solutions to sensing and control in aerial robots. But one limitation of this work is that so far the primary focus and source of inspiration has been flying insects. There have been relatively few attempts to kind of take this same approach with human visual control. And I think there are really good reasons for adopting this same kind of synthetic approach with a focus on humans. So it would provide an opportunity to test the kind of computational neural models of optic flow processing in primates, but using a real world context within a real world context. An opportunity to explore aspects of visual control that are important for humans, but maybe not quite so relevant for certain kinds of flying insects, things like the active gaze strategies that I'll talk about soon. And a new source of inspiration, so skilled human drone pilots who are capable of flying at very fast speeds in cluttered environments based primarily on vision. So that's kind of the backdrop for the work that I'm going to present here today. We're still at the early stages in terms of robotic implementation, but we have spent a lot of time thinking about how to make our models of human optic flow based control and perception work using more realistic input, which I think is a critical first step. So here's kind of an overview of my talk. It's organized around these three projects, all of which are aimed at better understanding and capturing the robustness and flexibility and the efficiency of optic flow based perception and control in humans. And as you see here, the names of the people who are who took the lead on each of these projects: Oliver and Scott and Nate and Xavier. So just to kind of anticipate, the main idea that I want to communicate in this first part of this talk is that heading perception is based on the temporal evolution of the optic flow field rather than an instantaneous snapshot. And by kind of adhering to this instantaneous snapshot assumption as we develop theories and models, I think we kind of struggle to capture, in particular, the robustness and the stability of human heading perception. If that's correct, I think it would be important not only for vision science, but also to kind of guide us in the development of bio-inspired algorithms that actually have a chance of working in real world conditions. So a good place to start is with the absence of temporal dynamics in most existing computational neural models of optic flow processing. Common feature shared by most of these models is that the heading estimate at each time step is based entirely on a snapshot of the instantaneous optic flow at that one instant, right? So neither the optic flow at the previous time step nor the heading estimate at the previous time step influence the estimate of heading at the current time step that's recovered by these models. Now, in fairness, this is typically not necessarily an explicit assumption, and I think that some of the designers of these models wouldn't necessarily oppose the idea that heading perception is based on more than a snapshot, but the fact remains that these models in their current form really lack mechanisms for capturing how heading perception might depend on the temporal evolution of the flow field. So to appreciate why models based on an assumption of a snapshot assumption are fragile, I think it's helpful to think about some of the challenges of estimating heading direction from optic flow in the real world. So here's a great video from work by John Mathis showing legged locomotion over complex terrain. Actually, this is a fairly flat terrain, but as the head moves up and down and side to side, generates optic flow that definitely lacks that stable radial structure. In other situations, optic flow can be sparse and patchy due to the presence of large regions of the visual field with no discernible visual structure. There could be globally discrepant optic flow due to factors like blowing snow, right? Or locally discrepant optic flow due to independently moving objects. So this is a scenario that I'm going to focus on. So let's take a closer look at a few of the frames that you just watched here. So at this particular instant, the torso and the head of the walker are generating leftward flow opposite the flow from the background, while the motion of the legs creates a kind of swirl in the optic flow field. A moment later, an FOE-like pattern right here, a kind of pseudo FOE, emerges as the two pedestrians pass by each other, moving in opposite directions. A short time later, after the walker crosses the path, more FOE-like patterns emerge in front of the pedestrian, as this is occurring for various reasons that I won't go into at this point, but is quite common in these scenarios. And kind of highlighting all of the flow associated with the pedestrian, as well as her shadow, we see that somewhere between a quarter and a third of the visual field is occupied by discrepant flow that's inconsistent with the observer's background FOE. So at almost every instant, there are coherent patterns of motion that are discrepant with the flow from the stationary background. And at the same time, the background flow is sparse in certain regions, right? So, you know, in the upper visual field and near the background FOE due to the large depth of objects in that direction. So the point is that a model that simply takes the instantaneous flow field and finds the region that at that instant is most similar to the focus of expansion would generate kind of wildly inaccurate and varying heading estimates under these conditions. But when you look at this video, right, you have no problem seeing that the camera is moving along a straight path down the center of the street, right? You perceive that your heading is not being dramatically perturbed as pedestrians cross your path. And that's consistent with psychophysical studies of heading perception in the presence of moving objects. So these studies show that heading estimates are biased, but only by a few degrees, 2 to 4 degrees typically, and only when the object occludes or almost occludes the background FOE. In other words, human heading perception is quite robust and stable in the presence of moving objects. So to what should we attribute this kind of robustness and stability? Well, one answer to that question is segmentation. So the idea that the visual system kind of identifies and then segments the flow from the moving object and then uses the remaining flow, which is entirely background flow, to estimate heading. And there are numerous static and dynamic cues that the visual system can use to segment moving objects during self-motion. But the empirical support for the segmentation hypothesis is kind of mixed. There's a recent paper by the DeAngelis and Angelaki team using stimuli depicting combined self-motion and object motion like what you see here. But on some trials, the moving object, the kind of red blob there, is moving slower. So it's hard to tell whether those things are stationary or moving. And what they found, the sort of critical finding, was that on trials in which the moving object was correctly perceived as moving, heading judgments were more accurate. They were less biased compared to trials in which the object was misperceived as stationary. So this supports a kind of segmentation account because it suggests that when moving objects are correctly detected, the flow from the moving object is discounted in the estimation of heading. But on the other hand, in the overwhelming majority of studies demonstrating heading biases resulting from moving objects, the moving object was easily identifiable, as it should be for you in this video here. I mean, even the addition of things like color contrast and binocular disparity, biological motion cues that help to kind of facilitate segmentation don't reduce the bias. So that implies a kind of spatial pooling mechanism that pools motion across the visual field, regardless of whether it corresponds to moving objects or the stationary background. So these kind of pooling models predict a bias because the flow from the moving object, it's an approaching object, radiates from one location and the background flow from another location. So a pooling model doesn't differentiate flow from the object in the background. So the heading estimate is effectively a weighted average of the two FOEs. Now, although spatial pooling models correctly predict the direction of the heading bias in human subjects, they also predict that the bias would be much larger than a few degrees under certain conditions. So this figure here comes from a simulation study by Oliver Layton and I. This shows heading error as a function of time for the motion pooling model. That's the kind of yellowish or mustard curve here. as the object approaches and starts to cross the observer's path. And what I want to sort of draw your attention here is the fact that the heading error just explodes to over 20 degrees in one direction before swinging to almost 30 degrees in the opposite direction, right? So this is what a motion pooling model would give you under such a scenario. A third possibility, and one that I think is most plausible, is that heading perception is a process that kind of evolves over time and is based on the temporal evolution of the optic flow field rather than a simple snapshot. In other words, perceived heading at any instant is based not only on the instantaneous flow at that moment, but also on optic flow prior to that point. And a few years ago, Oliver and I tested this hypothesis in a series of experiments. So the basic task is sort of a standard heading perception task in which subjects viewed a short stimulus similar to what you see here. And then at the end of the trial, they would position a probe to indicate their perceived heading. Just a quick heads up, the main conclusion is based on results from 2 experiments, and I need to explain both. So just bear with me for the next couple of minutes here. So first, we created a set of conditions where the moving object occluded the observer's path during the early, middle, or late part of the trial, or various combinations like early, middle, late, including the entire duration of the trial. What this figure shows is the heading bias for each of the different object occlusion conditions. And the main finding is that heading perception is biased only when the object occluded or almost occluded the future path during the end of the trial, so during the last 500 milliseconds. When occlusion takes place earlier in the trial and the background FOE is revealed before the trial ends, then heading perception is unaffected or weakly affected. So what this tells us is the following. If the instantaneous flow assumption is correct, heading perception is most likely based on optic flow at some moment that occurred during the last 500 milliseconds of the trial. Now, having established that fact, we can now turn to the second experiment, which is the critical test of this kind of temporal evolution hypothesis. So our approach was to vary the duration of the earlier part of the trial leading up to that last frame that was presented to subjects. So for each kind of object observer trajectory, there were 6 conditions, 3 of which you see here in kind of a schematic form, that varied in duration from 150 milliseconds to 1500 milliseconds. So the last 150 milliseconds were the same across conditions, but conditions with longer durations also included the earlier part of the event leading up to the last 150 milliseconds. So here are the predictions. If the instantaneous flow assumption is correct, and if heading perception is based on optic flow at some moment during the last 500 milliseconds, which was the main finding from the previous experiment, then increasing trial duration beyond 500 milliseconds shouldn't affect heading perception. On the other hand, if heading perception depends on the temporal evolution of the flow field, then increasing trial duration, so including more of the earlier part of the trial before occlusion, should result in a smaller bias, and that's what we found. So heading bias was greatest when the stimulus was short in duration and only included the portion of the event in which the moving object occluded the background FOE. But when the duration increased, and the earlier part of the sequence prior to occlusion was included, then the heading bias was reduced from almost 6 degrees to almost 2 degrees. So we interpret this as clear evidence that heading perception is a process that evolves over time based on the changing flow field. Having demonstrated that, the next question is, how does heading perception depend on the temporally evolving flow field? So one possibility is that the neural mechanisms involved in heading perception have states that kind of evolve over time, right? That depend not only on the optic flow field at that instant, but also on the activation at prior points in time. And this is actually one of the distinctive features of the competitive dynamics model that I mentioned earlier. So for example, units in model MSTD exhibit a kind of on-center, off-surround recurrent competitive dynamics. So each unit kind of competes for its heading representation by enhancing the signal for its preferred heading and suppresses other heading signals. Also, the network is a dynamical system, so the heading estimate kind of builds up over time and depends not only on the instantaneous optic flow, but also on the evolving flow leading up to that instant. So as a result, the heading estimates are more stable over time, and the model is less disrupted, less biased by discrepant optic flow, such as that introduced by moving objects. So here again is the plot showing estimates of previous models. And here's the competitive dynamics model, the kind of pinkish curve right there. The bias is close to 0 and very close to that which is observed in human subjects. Again, this is because the heading estimate is based on the evolving optic flow field, including the period before the object started to occlude the most informative regions of the background flow. So this kind of stabilizing effect of recurrence is also apparent in more real-world scenarios, such as the neighborhood scene that I showed you earlier. So first, I'm going to show you a video that shows model performance with the recurrent signal turned off. And I want you to pay attention to how the heading estimate swings left and right as the pedestrians cross in front of the camera. There it is. So notice that the bias reaches about 12 degrees, so about 3 to 4 times greater than any bias observed in human studies. Now let's turn the recurrent signal back on, and you can see much more stable and accurate estimate. So the main takeaway from this part of the talk is the following. Human heading perception is more stable and accurate than models based on an instantaneous snapshot assumption can predict. So heading perception must be a process that evolves over time based on the changing flow field. We think that recurrent competitive dynamics might play a key role in stabilizing heading estimates, not only in the presence of moving objects, but also in other contexts that pose challenges to these kind of snapshot models, like when optic flow is sparse or when it's intermittent, so you get like intermittent blackout or something. The other thing about this is that it provides a mechanism for enhancing heading estimation in aerial robots that rely on optic flow, right? Where these kind of idealistic assumptions are not necessarily satisfied. Okay, so moving on to the next project here, dynamic efficient sensory encoding. So this kind of continues on with this theme of building models that are robust and adaptive and able to function in different conditions, like biological vision systems. Now, a general problem that both biological vision systems and neural models of such systems face is having to efficiently encode a wide range of stimulus values with a finite number of neurons or units. In the competitive dynamics model, this issue is apparent in the encoding of optic flow speeds. So the local motion in any small region of the visual field, like the region that I'm kind of highlighting here in red, is encoded in terms of the activity of neurons in model MT. So each individual unit responds to kind of a range of directions and speeds, but it's really the speed selectivity that's relevant for the present purposes. So I'm going to focus on this part down here. Speed tuning in the model is Gaussian shaped. So the response of any particular MT neuron varies depending on the magnitude of the flow vector in its receptive field, as well as the tuning parameters of that neuron, its mean and its standard deviation, right? So a faster speed would give a different response. And for a neuron tuned to a different speed, that would also give a different response. Now, during self-motion, optic flow speeds depend on a whole bunch of factors, right? How fast you're moving, your eye height, rotation rate, the direction, depth, and orientation of objects and surfaces, and so on. Here's a video depicting self-motion through a simulated environment that illustrates this point with optic flow superimposed. Note the wide range of optic flow speeds and how the distribution of speeds changes over time. We can sort of better visualize this by looking at a histogram that shows the distribution of speeds over the past 10 frames. And just note how, how dramatically that distribution changes over time. Now, remember that each individual layer of MT has units that are sensitive to a particular range of speeds. So that layer only kind of sees speeds within that particular range. So cells that are tuned to slow speeds are active, indicated by yellow here, only when there's slow optic flow in their receptive field. In this case, that's generally in locations that are distant from the camera. Likewise, cells that are tuned to fast speeds that respond, those respond only to regions where the optic flow is fast. So depending on the range of speeds to which a particular layer is tuned, that layer is going to sort of see a different portion of the optic flow field, which becomes really apparent when we watch these two videos side by side. So given these facts, we can appreciate the negative consequences of poor tuning, right? There may be some regions to which the model as a whole, even across all layers, is effectively blind or at least less sensitive. This is a really important point, right? Because if poor tuning causes the model to only use a small portion of the available flow, then it's going to function poorly. It'll be less accurate and less responsive. Now, you might think that the best solution is to uniformly tile the range of stimulus values that could be experienced, but that only makes sense if speeds arise with equal probability, right? And we can't just sort of compress everything down to a narrow range, because then we would lose the ability to encode faster or slower optic flow speeds. So a more efficient and principled use of resources would be to recruit more neurons for signaling common stimulus values, so that such stimuli could be encoded more precisely, and then fewer neurons to signal less commonly encountered stimulus values. In 2014, Ganguly and Simoncelli developed an approach rooted in the efficient coding hypothesis for calculating the peak locations and widths of optimal tuning curves for a given stimulus distribution. Essentially, the stimulus values that occur frequently are encoded by a larger number of units with narrow tuning curves, and values that occur less frequently get fewer units with wider tuning curves. Now, this approach, which Ganguly and Simoncelli referred to as efficient sensory encoding, is really ideally suited for situations in which the stimulus distribution is stationary, but not so ideal for dynamic environments. And I showed you a few minutes ago how the statistics of the optic flow speeds vary over time as the observer's motion and distance relative to objects and surfaces change. So a grad student in my lab, Scott Steinmetz, had this wonderful idea of creating a kind of dynamic version of efficient sensory encoding that dynamically adjusts the means and the standard deviations of the tuning curves based on the ranges of speeds that are encountered or recently. So here's a video that illustrates this approach with the tuning curves that are dynamically changing on the bottom right. So this is dynamic efficient sensory encoding in action. This is really helpful because it captures how the network could encode speeds across a wide range of precision without increasing the number of units. So to use the available resources efficiently. So we tested the effectiveness of dynamic efficient sensory encoding by conducting some simulation experiments that compared heading estimates generated by a model with dynamic tuning against those generated by models without dynamic tuning. And we basically used a bunch of videos similar to what you see here, depicting self-motion in different directions in 2 different environments. There were 5-second videos, and you'd get 1 second of motion in a particular direction, and then a switch to a new direction. And each video would last about 5 seconds, so 5 segments. So this gives us a kind of natural sampling of widely varying optic flow. And then we fed that input into 3 different versions of the model. The main condition of interest is the model with dynamic tuning. So in this experiment, dynamic tuning was based on the distribution of optic flow speeds over the past 10 frames. And then we had 2 other conditions with static tuning. So the first is static tuning kind of adjusted to the entire distribution of optic flow speeds, pooled across the entire set of videos, right? So about 10,000 frames in all. So we call this the static aggregate tuning condition. And then there's also another control condition, which is a model that with static tuning adjusted to a uniform distribution of optic flow speed. So that's the static uniform condition. So performance measures are based on model heading estimates. So this is similar to the video that I showed you earlier, right? And here's kind of a time series of the heading error with peaks at the points in time where the heading shifts, right? So this is basically the model kind of catching up to that abrupt change in heading. So what we're looking for here is the kind of converged heading error, right? That's one measure of performance, right? The kind of error that it converges onto after a bunch of frames. And then also the latency, so the number of frames it takes for the model to converge onto an accurate estimate. So what we found is that the model with dynamic encoding is more accurate. So the heading error converges to a smaller value. Now the difference relative to the static aggregate condition is only about 1.5 degrees, but keep in mind that this represents an improvement of about 20%. Interestingly, the improvement was not just in the final heading error, but also in how quickly the model reached that estimate. So the latency. This figure shows the average best fitting sigmoid for each condition. You see clearly that the dynamic condition converged more quickly, so in fewer frames. And this makes sense, right? Because the model is basically more sensitive to motion, right? It's able to accumulate more evidence on each frame. So a few takeaways from this part of the talk. First of all, dynamic efficient sensory encoding, we think offers a principled approach for capturing adaptation to varying visual environments. And we've shown through these simulation experiments that it generates more accurate heading estimates in fewer frames. It also enables the model to flexibly adapt to new environments and to new forms of self-motion without modeler intervention. In fact, it's worth mentioning here that this idea actually emerged in Scott because he was kind of tired of having to hand tune the model parameters every time he captured video from a new scenario or environment. And he eventually kind of stumbled upon this Ganguly and Simoncelli solution. And then, it was a matter of kind of applying a dynamic version of that, a simple, but I think powerful idea. So I don't have time to talk about this now, but if you're interested, be happy to talk about things like biological plausibility of this solution, as well as how a kind of a downstream area could actually make sense of the signals from MT if the tuning is continually changing. Okay, so the third and final project kind of expands the lens a little bit to include not only perception, but also control. This is ongoing work. It's actually the main focus of Nate Powell's PhD thesis, but Xavier Marshall, who was an undergrad game studies major at RPI, is also playing a critical role. So the starting point for this project is the following idea, that a key component to the skillful negotiation of complex environments is the ability in humans to actively direct gaze to reveal relevant information, right, and to coordinate gaze behavior with movement. That may seem obvious to some of you, but the role of active gaze in many visual locomotor tasks is not particularly well understood or appreciated, and certainly not well captured in many models of visual control. So, take models of steering while avoiding obstacles, intercepting and avoiding moving objects on foot, catching fly balls, and so on and so forth, right? In most of these information-based models or strategies, the role of eye movements is really neglected. One notable exception is studies of steering along a car along a winding path, or through gates, like in a slalom kind of a task. Some really nice early work by Mike Land suggested that drivers fixate this kind of tangent point in the road, and that by doing so, they reveal information about the upcoming road curvature. More recent work by Otto Lappi indicates that drivers seek out these kind of waypoints instead, and then these are basically points through which they want to steer. In 2008, Rich Wilkie, John Wan, and your own Rob Allison studied gaze while steering through a slalom course and revealed important insights into the timing of gaze switching from one gate to the next, to the upcoming gates. So this is all really great work, but the accounts that sort of emerged from this research are really restricted to certain conditions, like a static environment, a well-defined path, right? Self-motion parallel to a flat ground surface with no obstacles and no occlusions. Another context that provides, I think, ideal opportunities to better understand active gaze and visual control is FPV, or first-person view drone racing. So this is drone racing in which the pilot wears a head-mounted display that streams video from a drone camera while they're navigating their drone through a complex course at oftentimes impressively high speeds. And this is sort of ideal in many ways, right? So it's a task that relies primarily on vision. Subjects do sort of path following and simultaneously obstacle avoidance tasks, and sometimes with moving obstacles. They're moving in three-dimensional space, right? So not just restricted to the ground plane, and are oftentimes moving through naturalistic environments, including wooded environments. Another benefit to exploring this area is access to skilled pilots, right? So there are lots of college-age students, right, who have practiced doing this and are willing to kind of participate in studies. Now, studying eye movements in first-person view drone racing pilots in the real world poses some challenges, right? So tracking the drone movement would be difficult, if not impossible. Limited ability to introduce experimental manipulations, as well as to control the environment, things like weather and wind and lighting and things like that, as well as the safety of the subjects and the equipment. So we set out to develop an experimental setup to study eye movements of drone pilots in simulated environments. And that's what I'm just going to sort of finish up telling, but I'm going to use the last few minutes of my talk to tell you about this work. It's work that we've done over the past 18 months or so to create a setup for studying eye movements in drone racing pilots, which to our knowledge has not been done before. We don't yet have data from this particular project, in part because of COVID-related restrictions, but I do think that this setup is sufficiently novel to be worthy of mentioning in the talk, and I hope you agree with that. Also, it gives me an opportunity to get feedback from people here who have lots of expertise in things like 3D virtual displays, as well as visual vestibular integration. So we use the Unity game engine to create visually realistic environments. Lots of opportunities to customize these environments, right? So we're using like a scene and terrain generator that allows us to kind of shape the terrain in ways that we want, to paint paths through the forest, place trees, introduce drones with, semi-realistic dynamics and so on. So here's a video that Xavier recorded as he's kind of painting the path through this forest. And here's a bird's eye view of the environment with the path highlighted. It's bigger than it looks, so it takes about 60 to 90 seconds to complete the loop at a fairly high speed. And there are more kind of twists and turns than is clear from this particular view. So here's a first-person view of what this looks like. This drone is being controlled by Nate Powell, who, again, he's the graduate student who's taking the lead on this project. He's still relatively novice drone pilot, but this is really hard. So even being able to do this took a lot of practice. And you can see at the end here, there's a collision. So we do collision detection as well as he comes up on one of the gates at an awkward angle. There you go. Now, steering and control and speed are controlled using a kind of a standard RC controller of the sort that drone racing pilots use. And the scene is viewed through an HTC Vive HND. So the monitor here is really just for testing purposes. The pilots see the scene through the head-mounted display. And then the HMD is equipped with a Pupil Labs eye tracker that enables us to track eye movements at rates up to about 200 hertz. So here's a portion of the same video that I showed you earlier, but with the gaze fixation crosshair superimposed. So you can see where Nate is looking as he's steering along this course. So again, this is really just sort of a demonstration of the experimental setup. It's extremely flexible and allows for experimental manipulations that are not possible in the real world, but the first study is just going to be exploratory. So no one has ever looked at the gaze behavior of drone racing pilots. This is really the first. So the first step that we need to take is to kind of figure out where pilots are looking and how gaze and steering are coordinated. And to do that, we'll take advantage of certain built-in features that allow us to kind of cast rays from the camera along the gaze direction until they intercept an object that helps us figure out what people are looking at. And then we also plan to explore how gaze behavior varies with task and environment. So things that are relatively easy to do in the simulated environment. In parallel with the drone piloting subject study, we're developing a drone to simulate active gaze strategies for steering and obstacle avoidance. So this is work that's led by Devervrat Giovanni, who's a postdoc in my lab with expertise in computer vision and robotics. So the setup will use a gimbal mounted camera that rotates to kind of fixate and track different features of the scene, such as paths and gates and obstacles as the drone is moving. Now, obviously, camera rotation is much slower than eye rotation, but the hope is that we can sort of figure out how this works, and then maybe the gap in technology will close, and these cameras will be able to move at a higher rotation rate. So the idea here is to kind of build a setup that allows us to test the active gaze strategies from the drone pilot study on an actual drone, right? Much like others whose work I mentioned earlier implemented optic flow based strategies used in flying insects on drones. So to my knowledge, this would be the first attempt to implement human-like active gaze strategies on a quadcopter. So fingers crossed. Yeah, there's a simulation, but I'll skip that in the interest of time because I'm running out of time. So some final words as we end here. First, sort of some more concrete takeaways. Neural models of optic flow processing can better capture robustness and robustness of human heading perception by incorporating temporal dynamics as well as adaptive tuning. And then studying eye movements of skilled drone pilots may reveal new strategies for steering and obstacle avoidance that could be implemented on small aerial robots. And then the last two are sort of more general and kind of highlighting the approach that we're trying to develop here. Really have come to appreciate the fact that testing models in realistic virtual and real world environments is important, and it forces us to consider the robustness and the efficiency of our solutions. Again, I didn't really appreciate how kind of fragile are the models and solutions that we had previously were until we tried to test them in real world scenarios. Looking ahead, I think small aerial robots really offers a nice natural test bed for exploring optic flow based strategies, not only in flying insects, but also those used by humans. So I will end there, and I want to thank the sponsor of the research, ONR, as well as the graduate students and collaborators and undergraduate students who have contributed to this work. And thank you for your attention.